Hi guys, and welcome back to the early bird photo news, still from my Airbnb bedroom. But why don't we jump right in and talk about the two newest cameras in town, the Canon R8 and R50. I do think Canon has made the camera game a lot more competitive with these two bodies and has put Nikon and Sony on notice. While some of you may dislike the fact that the cameras don't have any IBIS or joysticks on the back, what we have to keep in mind is the market segment that these cameras are actually aimed at. And for their price point, they offer specs pretty much unheard of. We also cannot ignore the fact that most people actually stick with the camera brand that they initially buy. So the first camera people buy has a very important role. A lot of these customers will stick with the brand long term and will start buying the more expensive stuff later on. Keeping this in mind, it actually makes a lot of sense for Canon to target this lower photography segment of the market, while also appealing to higher end content creators by offering amazing video specs not seen in any camera at that price point. So let's talk about the R8. When we first heard about it a few months ago, I wasn't excited at all. I thought, why do we need another low-end camera? But then last week, when we heard about the first specs, I thought, sounds pretty darn good for a camera costing only $14.99. But now, since we've seen the whole thing, I'm kind of torn. I do a lot of filming, so some of these features really appeal to me and are unrivaled in low-end bodies, like uncropped 4K 60 for instance. And when it comes to the photo features, the R8 actually shines as well. We have a great 24 megapixel full frame sensor from the R6 II. We have fantastic eye tracking from the R6 II. We have 20 frames per second in electronic shutter mode at 14-bit RAW files and up to 40 frames per second in 12-bit RAW mode. So these specs sound pretty awesome and are very similar to the R6 II at a much lower price point. Where the camera actually kind of falls apart for me is the body and the ergonomics. Starting with the much smaller LPE 17 batteries instead of the larger batteries that we can find in the R5, R6 and R7 series. So while not a deal breaker for some, I definitely would have preferred having the same batteries and the same larger batteries because they also last a lot longer. But since the camera body is pretty much the same as the one from the Canon RP, I think Canon decided they want to keep the batteries small and light. And we can also find the same batteries in the Canon R50 and the R10. So it seems like Canon is favoring the smaller and less powerful batteries in the lower end cameras. Having only one SD card slot isn't great either, but also not a deal breaker at the same time, and at least it's a fast UHS 2 slot. What will make using the camera difficult in the field is actually the lack of a third wheel, because it makes it so much easier to shoot in the different camera modes, and especially when you're using manual mode, having third wheels is crucial to be able to change your settings quickly. And the biggest deal breaker besides the smaller batteries may actually be the lack of a joystick on the back of the camera, because it will make it so hard to navigate your autofocus points around. And while there are workarounds, I really don't fancy owning a camera without a joystick on the back. So not having a joystick is probably the biggest deal breaker for me and much more crucial than not having the IBIS, for instance. While IBIS is nice, I think a lot of people don't really notice the lack of IBIS. Me, for instance, the way I would use this camera often on a tripod, I wouldn't really notice the lack of IBIS at all. However, if you were planning to do a lot of handheld photography, then having no IBIS will have a much greater impact, and you may be better off with a camera that has IBIS because you will be able to handhold much slower shutter speeds. What's strange about the R8 is that it has no mechanical shutter, and we only have the option of first curtain electronic shutter and full electronic shutter. And the strange thing for me is that with the first curtain electronic shutter, where you have very minimal or no rolling shutter, the camera can only shoot 6 frames per second, which is very, very slow for today's standard. So in essence, that forces you to use the electronic shutter almost all of the time. And then you can either use it in 20 or 40 frames per second mode, have to deal with a little bit of rolling shutter, and then the buffer will also become an issue because the buffer is about 50 RAW files. So if you're shooting at 40 frames per second, you can only shoot for just over a second before your buffer is full. So while the camera overall is great for photographers, there's definitely some strange bottlenecks. And it feels like Canon took out that cripple hammer here and there and knocked off a few great features to keep the price point low and to separate it from other cameras like the R6 Mark II. I do, however, see many people who currently own an R or an RP upgrading to this camera, and I also think this camera will be a hit with many new people entering the hobby. The second camera we got this week is the Canon R50. Very small and lightweight 24 megapixel APS-C camera similar to the R10 but at a much lower price point and much less weight. Just like the R8, the R50 also has no IBIS, no joystick on the back of the camera and just one SD card slot. And in this case actually a slow UHS 1 SD card slot. However, I suppose no one is really planning to shoot fast action with this camera, so it may not matter. And while the video specs of 4K 30 uncropped and downsampled are very nice, the photo specs are not so impressive. We have 12 frames per second with the first curtain electronic shutter mode and 15 frames per second with the electronic shutter mode. So for some reason the R50 gets to take twice as many shots with the first curtain electronic shutter compared to the R8. However, the real bottleneck on this camera is the buffer of only, sorry I have to laugh, 7 RAW files. So whenever you're in electronic shutter mode, you're shooting at 15 frames per second. That's less than half a second of shooting before you're hitting the buffer. So in my opinion, that shows that the camera is probably aimed at people shooting JPEG and in full auto mode, and RAW is more of an afterthought on this camera, although it has the fantastic eye tracking and many of the great features and good speed. Where you can see these two cameras really shine is standing on the shelves at your favorite electronic retailers, because we have amazing specs at great price points and none of the competition actually offers cameras with these kinds of specs at those low price points. So I think these cameras will be very intriguing for many people and I can see them literally flying off the shelves. As we said at the beginning of this video, a lot of people stick with the first camera brand that they buy. So Canon pushing into this segment will actually put a lot of pressure onto Sony and Nikon, and it will be interesting to see if they follow Canon's lead into this sort of lower market segment or if they stick with what they have at the moment. Because neither Nikon nor Sony have cameras that seem to be able to compete with what the R8 and the R50 offer currently. They may release other cameras in the future, but currently Nikon for instance has the Z5 that has IBIS and a better EVF, but when it comes to the photo features like the autofocus or the video features, it's no match to the R8 or even the R50. And when we look at Sony, we either have the A7 III, but that costs around $2,000, or we have the A7 II that costs under $1,000, but just can't compete when it comes to the specs of the cameras. So what do you guys think? Are Nikon and Sony letting Canon take this lower end segment off the market, or are they going to aggressively push into that segment as well? Seeing all these specs in an R8 or even an R50 for like $700 does make me think we will likely see an R5 Mark II this year as well. Because even a camera like the R50 has some features that an R5 currently doesn't have, like no recording limits and actually a slightly better autofocus from the R3/R6 Mark II. So while the R5 is more than a capable camera and I would be happy to wait much longer for a replacement, I do feel like we will see a replacement sometime this year just to bring some new features into the camera and just kind of reposition it in the market with hopefully no overheating, more autofocus features and a couple extra treats for us photographers. No matter what camera you own though, it's important that you learn how to edit your RAW files to perfection. And this is where I would love to help you get there faster with my Pro Sets and Masterclass. With my Pro Sets, I enable you with just one click to transform your dull, boring RAW files into a great starting point for the editing process. And in my Masterclass, I teach you step by step all the necessary things you need to know in Photoshop to make your own images look absolutely amazing. So if this is of interest to you, make sure to check this out down there in the description. So while the R8 and the R50 may not be perfectly suited for photography, they do seem to be fantastic video cameras, and I know many people will be very happy with them in the studio and in the field when it comes to video work. That also already kind of answers the question how these cameras compare to an R6 II or an R7 for instance. Because for photography, I would definitely favor an R6 II over the R8 because it has the joystick, it has the third wheel, it has better overall ergonomics, it has the 2 card slots, it has IBIS, and it also has the larger battery. So if you can spare that extra $1,000, I think the R6 II, it's a much more appealing choice for photographers than the R8. However, if budget is of a serious concern, then I think the R8 can still be a fantastic photography camera for you if you can work around some of these obstacles like the missing joystick. The same is kind of true for the R7, although it's actually hard to compare a 32 megapixel APS-C crop camera to a 24 megapixel full frame camera because one has the ultimate reach and one will have slightly better image quality and likely autofocus. When it comes to the ergonomics, both of these cameras are actually kind of messed up. The R7 has its own kind of set of ergonomics that are kind of annoying to use to me, and the R8 will have another set of ergonomics that are also annoying to use and probably worse to use than the R7, because the R7 at least has a joystick and a wheel on the back of the camera. But then again, the R8 has that ISO wheel on top that the R7 is missing. So it's almost kind of a draw when it comes to how messed up the ergonomics are on both of these cameras. But all in all, I think if you look at wildlife photography especially, the R7 will be a more appealing choice to many photographers because you have the joystick and you have the extra reach with that 32 megapixel APS-C sensor. However, if you're an all-round shooter that does a little bit of video, a little bit of photography, I think the R8 might actually be the more appealing choice if you don't need that extra reach from the R7. Because when it comes to video work, I would definitely prefer the R8 over the R7 because it just offers some more nice and appealing features. When it comes to Nikon, it has been awfully quiet lately and we haven't heard anything about new and upcoming cameras because I think that's what's really missing in the Nikon lineup currently. Smaller, lighter cameras that are very capable and coming in at a lower price point. There are some whispers that we might hear an announcement for a Z8 in the upcoming months, but we are not sure on that yet. However, I think this would be one camera that would fit fantastic into Nikon's lineup. It would likely have the Z9 sensor with a Z9 autofocusing system in a smaller body and at a smaller price. I think that's one of the cameras that's currently really missing from the lineup. But I think on top of a Z8, there's also a couple other cameras that are really missing. Something that's even a little bit lower end, smaller, lighter and more affordable, because Nikon has all these amazing lenses and there will likely be more amazing lenses coming out like the 200 to 600 millimeter lens, but currently Nikon doesn't have any cameras that match these lightweight and cheaper lenses very well. So having a greater variety of very capable cameras is something that I will look forward to in Nikon and hopefully something we'll see this year. And when it comes to Sony, we also haven't really heard anything new other than that we will have an announcement of a new camera in a couple months time and an A9 III later this year, which should actually be quite an exciting camera. However, since there are no more news right now, I think it's time to wrap up this week's episode of the Early Bird Photo News. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please give me a thumbs up. Leave me a comment down there with your thoughts and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye guys.